This is the story of DeBradford Walls and Colton Coke Johnston. Colton lived in London, Kentucky, and DeBradford lived in Paris, Kentucky. The two friends always joked about how they had NFL names, meaning they were different and recognizable. They also felt that because they each grew up in London and Paris, and whenever they told that to their friends online, they would make fun of them for living in the quote-unquote hick version of those famous locations. A little bit after Colton's freshman year, he got the nickname Coke because he didn't drink anything besides Coca-Cola, and DeBradford also got the nickname DB because he played corner for the high school football team in Berea, and DB was short form for DeBradford. Coke was hyped for the beginning of the season. He had set high expectations for himself after coming off of a junior season at the slot that saw him pull in 5 touchdowns with 400 receiving yards. His team was really pass-friendly, so he was the 5th receiver by yards on his team, and his coach didn't necessarily know what to do with him though, because he had grown to 6'3" over the last year. Eventually, his coach decided to start him at the outside with the hope that Colton's slot skill set would translate. In his first game, Coke looked awkward on the outside, so there was definitely some tweaks to be made over the course of the season. Coke often ad-libbed on his routes against both man and zone coverage, which at times was massively useful and at times it created mistakes. Luckily, Williamsburg was no threat to London despite miscues on the offensive end, with London taking the first win of the season with a blowout score of 58-9. Despite an up-and-down performance, Coke proved to be a threat anytime he got his hands on the ball, pulling in 14 catches with 5 of them going for touchdowns. One crazy game can be called a fluke, but Coke had a similarly productive performance in his second game of the season. DeBradford's team, on the other hand, started the season with a loss, but clawed their way back to a 500 record in the second game of the season. One thing that scouts and coaches disliked about the standout wide receiver is that he played outside of the structure of the offense too often. Sometimes it resulted in big plays, but it was also selfish to some extent, with Coke calling his own number pre-snap to his quarterback, calling out the defensive coverages and mismatches. And don't get me wrong, it was brilliant, like having a second quarterback's eyes on the field, and admittedly, it improved London's quarterback play, but it was in defiance of what the coach had drawn up plenty of times. When it paid off, Coke could get off the hook, but if it didn't, he was going to have a chat on the sideline with his offensive coordinator and head coach. To give some backstory on Coke and DB's relationship, DB always used to clown Colton because whenever they practiced together, he would lock him up. But during the summer before his senior year, Coke grew 4 inches from 5'11" to 6'3". He went from being a 1-star prospect to being a 4-star prospect before the season began. Despite DB being Colton's best friend, he was jealous of him because he felt like he had worked so much harder than Colton to be only a 3-star prospect. What Walls couldn't argue with though was that Coke was putting up massive games and his team was still undefeated. Coke Johnston quickly moved from being a 4-star prospect to being a 5-star and the #1 receiver recruit in the state. Coke was a bully on the field. In his junior season, he used to get laid out crossing over the middle of the field as a tiny slot receiver, but those days were over, and instead Coke was bullying tiny DBs on run plays. Coke, despite his route running technique, excelled primarily as a physical wideout that could utilize his size to outmuscle defensive backs for positioning when catching the ball. And Johnston showed that off versus Ellesmere, hauling in several deep balls en route to a one-sided victory for London. While Coke was physically gifted, DB was more of a gamer, having really high IQ and great feel at the corner position. He knew when to turn his head to find the ball in the air, when he could get away with grabbing, and how to bait quarterbacks into interceptions. Walls had a certain savvy to his game that Colton had yet to develop as a greener college prospect. At this point, Colton was being featured on High School Highlights IG as London remained undefeated at 4-0 after losing 5 games last year. The next game on the schedule for Coke would be the biggest of the season. He was playing against DeBradford's team, Berea. Walls played for Berea because Paris wasn't big enough to have their own team. DB didn't have the size or athleticism to necessarily keep up with Colton, but he did have better technique and great eye discipline. Coke was able to abuse most corners because of his athleticism, being 6'3" and usually faster than the DBs that he was lined up against, but his route running was still a little sloppy. Without a doubt, this would be the biggest test each of them would have during their senior years. London opened the game with a touchdown to take a lead early, and Berea couldn't answer on offense, but they did on defense as they ended up taking a pick to the house to tie the game at 7. Coke immediately got into his quarterback's ear to calm him down. While there was a bad image of Coke being a selfish teammate, he did know how to communicate with his teammates effectively. He was a little bit of a prima donna, admittedly, but he knew which teammates needed to be yelled at and which ones needed to be guided gently. The expectations were clear in this matchup between DB and Coke. Colton had become a 5-star recruit while DB was still a 3-star, so it was expected that Coke would continue his dominant streak that he'd maintained through the first half of the season. Walls took that assumption personally. Like I said, Walls was a gamer. He studied Colton's tape religiously to find out what his tendencies were, and after having practiced against him in previous years, DeBradford felt confident he could slow down Colton. Walls was able to disrupt Coke's timing on a couple routes and get into his head a little bit. DB was great at the peanut Tillman punch, meaning he wouldn't give up on the play if he saw the ball in Coke's hands, and instead he would go for the punch out to force the incompletion or a fumble. In the second, London's quarterback got baited into a pick by Walls while trying to throw to Coke, and Coke was livid on the sideline. Berea ended up scoring on the turnover to tie the game with 2 minutes left in the half, and London was able to get to Berea's red zone, but scouts were stunned with DeBradford's coverage on Coke and how much it had disrupted his timing on routes. Walls blanketed Coke, and Berea's defense held London at the 1-yard line to a field goal to end the half. London had passed for over 300 yards midway through the third, but it was more of the same from DB. London couldn't put it in the end zone, and Coke was mostly a non-factor in the second half. Steve Merca had thrown 3 picks already, and without a running game, the offense was looking unprepared to deal with their top wide receiver not being able to bail them out every play if needed. DB was locked in for this game because he knew that if he continued to give Coke trouble, unlike any other DB had this season, he would get his dream scholarship at Michigan that he had wanted. While Walls wanted to shut down Coke, he ultimately was looking forward to becoming teammates and hopefully playing together at Michigan. Walls cemented his win in this matchup against Colton when he got his second pick of the game and his 5th of the season by undercutting the corner route at the end of the third. Merca was having his worst game of the year with 4 picks through 3 quarters, but Colton talked with him on the sideline to try to get him right for the end of the game. You could call it backseat quarterbacking, but it had been effective all season. This time, instead of calling his own number, Coke was calling out his teammates who were burning their matchups. Merca had gotten so fixated on passing to Coke at this point in the season that he had abandoned his progressions entirely. So Coke was resetting Merca to actually read the defense instead of staring Colton down. Coke had to eat a little bit if he wanted to win the game, and he had to admit that DB was outplaying him in this matchup. Being humble is ultimately how London and Coke squeaked out the win. And after the game, Walls and Johnston shook hands and then went over to DeBradford's house to play some Madden and kick it. There were no hard feelings, but while at DB's house, Coke was getting blown up on social media about how he got clamped by DeBradford and that he was a sorry wideout to get shut down by a 3-star corner. But DB wasn't a 3-star corner for very long. A few days after the game, his scouting profile was updated to reflect a 4-star rating for him at corner, and he was a top 3 corner out of Kentucky finally. The only knock on him was that he wasn't very tall and he wasn't the most athletic, but everyone knew that he was a dog. Colton's hype and clout had dropped off a little bit. He had moved down to a 4-star prospect, but he was still the top wide receiver out of Kentucky, and at this point in the season, he was most concerned with getting his team to the playoffs. DB started having scouts regularly coming to his games, but he was only interested in talking to one person, Jim Harbaugh. But DB never got to speak to Harbaugh. Michigan eventually offered him to become a walk-on because they used their scholarships on other recruits. While DB didn't hear the news he wanted from Michigan, during London's run to go undefeated and make the playoffs, Jim Harbaugh came to a game in person to watch Coke take on Westwood at home. Harbaugh wasn't so much scouting Coke as he was trying to recruit him by visiting in person to offer him a scholarship to come play at the University of Michigan. Colton agreed on one condition: he needed Walls on the team too. Harbaugh agreed to the deal and also offered Walls the scholarship, and luckily a few Michigan prospects had committed to other schools, leaving some extra scholarships, and one was going to go to Walls. After a soft commitment to Michigan, Colton just had to worry about the rest of his senior year. In their last regular season game, London took a trip to Ashland. Ashland's defense started the game hot with a pick 6, and then they had clearly watched Walls' tape against Coke. They were trying to disrupt the receiver's timing by pressing him off the line on short yardage plays, and they played soft coverage in the middle of the field. Of course, Colton had watched his tape against Walls and found some workarounds to not get caught up against the same kind of coverage. The one big weakness still being Coke's thinner frame. He was athletic, but he hadn't fully grown into being 6'3" quite yet. While he could outmuscle defenders for the ball once he got going, it was harder for him to not get jammed off of the line. Ashland looked scary early, but Coke and his teammates took care of Ashland as they finished their season undefeated before moving on to the playoffs. Walls and Berea did end up making the playoffs too, despite 3 losses on their record. Berea lost in the first round to Ellesmere, and Coke had called DB to tell him to keep his head up, but the call wouldn't go through, and Coke tried texting to Bradford, but his texts weren't being delivered. Colton had the game against Corbin coming up that day, so he couldn't worry too much about it at the time. In the first round, Coke was winning all of his matchups. Corbin tried pressing, but Johnston burnt his man on the slant for the first down, and then before the end of the half, Corbin tried pressing at midfield, and Coke destroyed his matchup off the line, giving him one step to the left before accelerating upfield. Coke went down right at the 1 with 7 seconds left, and somehow the London kicker missed the field goal attempt. In the second half, Coke scored, and London London ended up blanking Corbin, winning the game 28-0. After the game, Coke found out that DB had blocked him, and he had no idea why. Later that day, Colton saw on Twitter that DB had decommitted from Michigan. So the dream of him and his best friend attending the same college collapsed midway through the playoffs, and Coke had no idea why DB was doing this. Coke reminded himself of how upset the team was after losing 5 games in the previous season and how they had all made a commitment to get back to the title game. Coke channeled that energy in his performance against Fort Wright. In the Kentucky State semifinals, Coke went off. Not one player in a chocolate Fort Wright jersey could cover him. Somehow Fort Wright had made it to the semis without a single D1 recruit, but their luck had run out with Coke showing what a future NFL player looked like next to true high school players. London put up 42 in the first half, and Coke finished the game with 4 touchdowns. Now it was time to prepare for the state championship in 2 weeks. Colton had a piece written about him in the town paper, calling him the King of London. There was still not even a word from DB congratulating him for making the state title game. Every time Coke looked for DB on Xbox, it said that he hadn't been on for days. The day after making it to state, Coke found out that London would be playing against Ellesmere, who London had already played, and it was also the team that DB got first rounded by. Johnston, even with DB blocking him, wanted to get revenge for his friend, and it was a nice little added motivation to taking the state championship. In the second quarter, Coke immediately recognized the too high safety look as cover 2 zone and separated himself from his teammate to his left as much as possible, and this confused the safety and left Coke wide open for a 60-yard catch and run for the score. London had the added mental advantage of having already beaten Ellesmere once, and so Coke was able to play freely, and Mirka wasn't too worried about making mistakes, instead letting Colton win contested catches. Colton did show off his route running in this game too. He excelled especially with corner routes, but if we're being honest, he was made for 9 routes and mossing DBs. London had a 20-point lead before half, and Mirka threw up a one-on-one ball that Coke surprisingly lost. In the second half, Coke ran a nice slant for a touchdown, and then it was garbage time. London had gone from 5 losses to state champs, and all it took was 4 inches. That's what she said. After the game, Colton checked his phone to see if DB had messaged him, but he hadn't. Coke wasn't sure if he still wanted to go to Michigan if DB wasn't going anymore. It took the joy out of it. Find out where Coke and DB land in the next episode.